I've returned with part 3. If you haven't seen the first two, then I really recommend that you do. But first watch this video, because if you click off at the beginning, it really hurts retention. Anyways, let's pick up right where we left off. The Saturn V was a super heavy lift vehicle that would take astronauts to the moon. I mean, this thing was huge. It had 3 stages. The first stage was powered by 5 F1 engines, with 1.5 million pounds of thrust each. The second stage had 5 J2 engines, and although they were less powerful, they were way more efficient with an impressive ISP of 420 seconds. Little side tangent, the original plans for the moon landing was for the Apollo CSM to land on the moon and directly ascend from the surface of the moon back to Earth. This mission profile would require a behemoth of a rocket they dubbed Nova. But this was when NASA basically had unlimited funding, so yeah. There's so many of these wacky rocket concepts. You could make an entire video out of them. Eventually, they figured out it would be a whole lot easier to have a smaller lander and a separate return craft that would stay in lunar orbit. Now let's talk about the actual mission profile for the moon landing. The first 2 stages would get the rocket almost to orbit. Then the third stage would ignite to put the spacecraft in a temporary parking orbit. After that, the J2 engine would relight and perform a translunar injection. After this, the command service module would separate and dock with the lunar module. Once they reached the moon, the service module's main engine would ignite to get captured into lunar orbit. Then the lander would undock and descend to the lunar surface. The lander was called the Lunar Excursion Module, or LEM, which was later shortened just to Lunar Module. It was split into 2 parts, the ascent stage and the descent stage. Inside of the descent stage were 5 compartments. The outer 4 held the fuel and oxidizer tanks, and the middle one housed the descent engine. In between these compartments were 4 quadrants, which were used to store equipment and science experiments. The ascent stage is where the astronauts would be. It had its own engine and fuel tanks, which it would use to lift off the moon. It also had some RCS thrusters for attitude control and docking with the CSM in orbit. Now on to the actual missions. Apollo 1 was meant to be the first crewed test flight, but a fire broke out in the cockpit shortly before launch, and since the cabin was pressurized with 100% oxygen, the fire quickly spread, tragically killing the crew. Some might think it was dangerous to use pure oxygen, but it wasn't as risky as it seems. In space, the cabin will only have 5 psi of pure oxygen, which matches the oxygen level on Earth. If they were to use this pressure on Earth, the atmosphere would quickly crush the capsule, so they had to increase the pressure inside of the cabin to maintain structural stability. Apollo 2 and 3 were cancelled while they were redesigning the pressurization system for the control module. Apollo 4 was the first test flight of the Saturn V, and it showed that the S4B stage could relight in orbit, and it simulated lunar re-entry speeds. Apollo 5 was launched on the Saturn 1B and tested the lunar module in orbit. Apollo 6 was going to simulate a translunar injection, but some extreme vibrations messed up some of the engines on the second stage, and the third stage failed to reignite in orbit. They did successfully recover the command module. Apollo 7 was launched to test the CSM and its ability to rendezvous in orbit by practicing with the S4B stage. Apollo 8 sent a crewed CSM to lunar orbit and back. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module and CSM in low Earth orbit. Apollo 10 was like a dress rehearsal for the Apollo 11. The mission profile would be almost identical, except the lunar module would descend to about 14 kilometers before boarding the descent stage and returning to lunar orbit. Apollo 11 was the mission that landed humans on the moon. It launched on July 16, 1969, successfully got into orbit, completed translunar injection, lunar orbital insertion, and they successfully touched down on the surface of the moon. I would go into more detail about the other lunar landings, but seeing how long the script already is, I'll just skim over the noteworthy ones. On Apollo 13, an oxygen tank ruptured. The crew barely made it out alive by using the lunar module as a lifeboat. There are a few records of some engineers accidentally dropping the oxygen tank, which may have caused the disaster. Apollos 15 and onward had an extended lunar module. This was to accommodate a higher payload, like the Lunar Roving Vehicle. Hey Congress, this is how much you owe us. Can we have some more money? We're cutting your budget. No more building Saturn rockets. But before their budget was reduced, they already had a bunch of Saturn V's ready. After Apollo 15, 3 Saturn V's were remaining. 2 of them were used for lunar landings, and the last one was used for Skylab, which was essentially just a hollowed out S4B stage that would be used as a space station. But the Americans weren't the only ones in the space race. The Russians were developing their own circumlunar spacecraft they called Zond. The Zond probe resembled the Soyuz without the orbital module. This program was trying to develop a crewed vehicle that could reach circumlunar space and return safely to Earth. The first 3 Zonds don't count, they were just renamed Veneras. Now Zond 4 was launched atop a Proton rocket, which was a heavy lift vehicle with 4 stages most of the time. The first stage was this bottom part here. It had 6 radial fuel tanks, which look a lot like detachable boosters, but they actually stayed attached to the core. The way it was designed, it had the oxidizer inside and the fuel on the outer tanks. Its second stage got it halfway to orbit, and the third stage finished the job. Once in orbit, the Block D would fire its engines to take the payload past low Earth orbit, which in this case was Zond 4. It went off course a bit during re-entry, so they destroyed it via a self-destruct mechanism to make sure those filthy Americans didn't try to steal their technology. Stingy Russians, what I tell ya. Zond 5 was actually successful by carrying some tortoises, bugs, and bacteria to the moon and back. Zond 6 was going to try to do the same thing, but it kinda depressurized and its parachutes failed to open. Zond 7 and 8 successfully flew by the moon, but by this time Apollo 11 had already happened, and they kinda cancelled the rest of the missions. The Zond probe could barely fly by the moon, let alone get captured and escape lunar orbit. To actually land on the moon, you would need a much more capable spacecraft. This lunar stack was made of 3 parts, the LOK-Soyuz, LK Lander, and Block D. Well, we'll talk about the LOK-Soyuz first. Like its name says, it's a variant of the Soyuz capable of leaving lunar orbit and returning to Earth. Like the regular Soyuz, it was split into 3 parts, the command module, service module, and orbital module. The command module is basically the same as a regular Soyuz, except it had a better heat shield to protect against the higher re-entry speeds. The orbital module was less similar to its Soyuz counterpart. First off, the docking port had no crew tunnel. Instead, the orbital module served as an airlock with a hatch where a cosmonaut would EVA its way to the LK lander. The service module was also a lot bigger to accommodate all the extra fuel it would need for a lunar mission. Unlike Apollo, the LOK-Soyuz wouldn't complete lunar orbital insertion. Instead, the Block D would fire its engines to get captured by the moon's gravity. Now onto the LK lander. It was a lot smaller than the LEM, only housing 1 cosmonaut. It was split into 2 parts, the ascent module and the landing assembly. The landing assembly wasn't really a stage like the LEM's descent stage. It housed no engines, only some small retro rockets that would fire in case of a rough landing. The main engines and fuel tanks were actually on the ascent module, but they only had enough delta V to get into lunar orbit once they landed. The way it actually landed on the moon is that it would use the Block D stage to slow down most of the way before landing under its own power. This whole lunar stack was launched by the N-1 rocket, which was the Soviet equivalent of the Saturn V. It was a 3-stage to orbit vehicle, with a 4th stage to carry the payload to translunar injection. The Russians really took the more the merrier approach with their engines, having 30 NK-15s on the lower stage. There were a couple test flights of the N-1, but sadly, none of them made it past stage separation. Which is kinda sad because the LK and LOK were proven to be reliable. It was just the N-1 that kept failing. The failures of the N-1, combined with the fact that the Americans beat them to the moon, led to the cancellation of the crewed Russian lunar program. Moving on. Crewed missions up to this point only lasted a few days or weeks, so it was difficult to do any long-term science. But what if you could have a large spacecraft that would stay in orbit for months at a time? The Russians really liked this idea, and thus, the Salyut program was born. The Salyut was a disposable space station that would be launched on a Proton rocket. It launched uncrewed because the Soyuz spacecraft would come and dock with it once it got in orbit. There were a couple Salyut missions, some more successful than others. Over time, these missions paved the way for something new and more advanced. Eventually, one of these Salyuts would be used for the core module of the Mir space station. The Mir station was the first modular space station. Mir was a big achievement in spaceflight history. It enabled long-term research in space. Inspired by this success, the United States wanted to make their own modular space station. It was going to be called Space Station Freedom. In order to build such a massive project, they would need a reliable way to transport crew and cargo to low Earth orbit. There was a lot of cool designs and concept art made for this. But this is the design they ended up choosing. The Space Shuttle was split into 3 parts. The orbiter, external fuel tank, and solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. The orbiter is what most people think of when they hear Space Shuttle, since it's the only part of the rocket that went to orbit. At the front of the orbiter is where the crew would reside. Behind the crew compartment is the cargo bay. The back of the orbiter housed a propulsion section with 3 RS-25s, which directly fed from the external fuel tank. While in orbit, it would use smaller AJ-10s that housed their own fuel inside the orbiter. The main engines themselves didn't have enough thrust to lift off the pad, so they added these SRBs to give the shuttle a boost it needed. While the shuttle was being developed, the Russians took some light inspiration. The Buran was just the Russian space shuttle, though it had a few differences. Unlike the space shuttle, the Buran was actually 2 different launch vehicles, the Energia and the Buran. This was part of the larger Energia family. Back to the Americans, even with their new space shuttle, Space Station Freedom, like all great space projects, had to be scaled down to actually be feasible. This smaller station was still a massive project. and the United States decided they couldn't do it alone. In this point in time, the US and the Soviets were actually starting to warm up to each other, and they decided to, along with some other nations, collaborate to make the International Space Station. The Russian Zarya module was first, shortly followed by the American Unity module. These were followed by a couple dozen other modules, and bam, you got a space station. This was all going good until the cancellation of the Space Shuttle. After this, space exploration had started to slow down. Yeah, they had the ISS and many other important missions were still underway, but this isn't compared to the plans devised at the height of the space race. NASA wanted to put people back on the moon, but it would be incredibly expensive to develop completely new technology, so they decided to use a lot of shuttle tech for this program. This was dubbed the Constellation program. It had its sights on landing people on the moon and possibly a lunar base, maybe even taking people to Mars. There were 2 rockets for this program, the Ares 1 and the Ares 5. The Ares 1 used an extended SRB for the first stage. Its main payload was the Orion crew capsule, which was kinda like the Apollo CSM. Sticking to analogies, the whole rocket was kinda like the Saturn 1B, only carrying the capsule to low Earth orbit. But if the Ares 1 was like the Saturn 1B, then the Ares 5 was like the Saturn 5. To actually land on the moon, you would need a lander, so they developed the Altair. Now to go over the actual mission profile. First, an uncrewed Altair would be launched into low Earth orbit by the Ares 5. Then, an Ares 1 would launch to take the Orion crew capsule to dock with the lander. Then, the second stage would relight its engine for a translunar injection. Unlike Apollo, the lander would complete the lunar orbital insertion. Once all that was done, all 4 crew would go into the lander, which would go on to separate and land. Once all the lunar stuff was done, the ascent module would lift off and dock with the Orion, which would then go back to Earth. Well, that was the plan at least. In reality, the program was far behind schedule, and the Obama administration decided to cancel it. Hey, we got this new program, it's gonna take people back to the moon. Imagine how patriotic it would be to replant that American flag. The Artemis program was basically just a scaled down version of the Constellation program. The main rocket for the Artemis program was the Space Launch System, or SLS. The original configuration it would take the Orion capsule and a relatively small payload to translunar injection. There were different configurations of this rocket which would accommodate larger payloads. The main goal of this program was to land a person back on the moon, which was scheduled for Artemis 3. This mission profile would launch a crewed Orion capsule into lunar orbit, where it would dock with the lander, land, rendezvous, and get back home. Well, they didn't really have a lander at the time since they cancelled Altair, so they decided to have a competition to see who could design and develop the best lunar lander. There were many options, but out of all of them, 3 were picked out. There was SpaceX's Lunar Starship, Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander, and Dynetics' Alpaca lander. And they picked Starship, which wasn't really the best choice for a plethora of reasons. But the mission's all in the future, and it's impossible to tell what's going to happen. If you've made it this far, you probably enjoy my other videos. Please like and subscribe. These videos take so long to make and it would really help out the channel a ton. And stay tuned for the next video.